Kia ora tātou katoa. Kia ora tātou katoa. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Andrew West, the Vice-Chancellor of Lincoln University, and today it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Costanza. He's currently Chair in Public Policy at the Australian National University in Canberra. The complementarity between your work, Bob, and that of Lincoln University's mission couldn't be greater. Our mission: feed the well, protect the future and live well. Professor Costanza's recent pioneering work on the limitations of GDP and the importance of genuine progress indicators resonate well here at this university. Bob was already firmly embedded in our work through our joint publications, including a recent high-profile book on ecosystem services. And I'm actually looking forward to debating that with you. As a lapsed ecologist, I really believe that we'll never properly define sustainability until we can move away from an entirely anthropogenic construct. So I think, the next year we could have some really good debates. He will return in January 2014 to help run an intensive workshop on optimal agriculture on planet Earth. It's a really exciting title. And this is likely to generate a high-profile publication and strengthen the collaboration between our two universities. Finally, Professor Costanza is also a key member of our Bioprotection Research Centre, and his formal recognition by Lincoln University as a distinguished visiting professor is pivotal. Frankly, it's pivotal to the rebid for this centre, which is being prepared now. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome you, and we're all really looking forward keenly to your address, Professor Costanza. Thank you. Is that on? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks for that wonderful introduction. And just one revision, we're probably going to do that optimal agriculture on Earth class a little bit later in the year, but we're hoping that you will all be involved in that in some way. Sustainability has become quite a popular word these days. This graph is showing that the rate of increase of the use of the word at the current rate, by the year 2036, it will occur on average once per page, and by 2061, it occurs average once per sentence, and 2109, all sentences are just the word sustainable repeated over and over and over and over and over and over. So, it's become maybe too popular of a concept, and I think part of the issue here is that anyone can call what they're doing sustainable, but it's really, what do we want to sustain? What sort of future do we want to create? How do we better understand not only sort of how the world works, our scientific paradigms and our understanding of the world, which is rapidly changing and progressing, I think, as we learn more about complex adaptive systems with thresholds and nonlinearities and all of that. And also as we learn more about human psychology and what the science of happiness, what actually does contribute to human well-being. And I think that we also have to think about how we would like the world to be. What is a desirable and sustainable future? What does that look like? So I think we need to spend a lot more time thinking about that. As the great American philosopher Yogi Berra once said, if you don't know where you're going, you end up somewhere else. So we need to figure out where we're going and not just sort of continue to follow our noses. And we need to do that, I think, in a much more engaged, as a much more engaged community globally. I'll talk a little bit about that as we go. And then our tools and analytical techniques and our implementation strategies and policies and institutions, I think, also need to be consistent with this changing vision if we really intend to try to solve some of the wicked problems that we're facing now around the issues of sustainability and desirability. So, the world has changed, and changed quite rapidly in the last 100 years or so. We now live in what some people are calling a whole new geologic era, the Anthropocene. Who's ever heard that term before, the Anthropocene? Okay. So this, the world is relatively full of humans and their artifacts these days, and we're having a significant influence on the functioning of our life support system, of our spaceship Earth. That changes a lot, I think, in terms of how we think about the relationship between humans and the rest of nature, and how we manage the planet. As I said, our scientific understanding is changing quite rapidly. We know that the world is a complex, nonlinear, adaptive system. It has thresholds, it has tipping points. We can expect surprises to happen. Things are not going to change nice and smoothly and gradually. This is from a paper by Tim Lenton and others in 2008, which tried to identify some of the potential tipping points in the climate system. You probably know about the ice sheets melting and what that could do in a relatively short period of time to change the climate. But there are several other potential tipping elements in that system. Dieback of the Amazon rainforest could really change things quite dramatically, or changes in the ENSO phenomena. And we know that, I think there's a re-recognition these days that we live on a finite planet. We cannot have infinite growth of the material part of the economy on a finite planet. And this was an attempt recently by Johan Rockström and a whole cast of thousands. I was part of that group that tried to identify what's the safe operating space for people on planet Earth. Where are the boundaries, the planetary boundaries that we need to stay within? We identified these 9 different variables, and this diagram shows that we concluded that 3 of those are already well outside the safe operating space: climate change, biodiversity loss, and the nitrogen cycle. And several others are rapidly approaching the safe boundaries. We know if we want a sustainable system, we're certainly going to have to stay within those boundaries. Of course, that's an inconvenient truth, and that's not the movie that most people are lining up to go see. So they would rather see a different movie. And I think the point here is that a lot of the way we've been framing the whole environmental debate, especially climate issues, is in a very negative way. It's the truth, but it's framed in a way that people are not really empowered or to do something about it. They would rather ignore it. So we need a third movie, I think. We need a third movie that makes the case for a sustainable and desirable future, a better world. And to do that, I think we have to recognize the embeddedness of the economy in society, in nature, and stop dealing with the economy versus into the environment. Stop dealing with these things as separate issues and start taking a much more integrated and systems approach over much longer time periods. I think that's what ecological economics is about. I think there's lots of parallel efforts to build a much more transdisciplinary understanding of these issues in order to solve the problems. We did a report recently for the UN in preparation for the Rio Plus 20 meeting that tried to lay out what that vision of the future would be, and also some policies for how to get there. I won't spend too much time. Well, I'll touch on some of these issues, but if you want some more detail, you can download this UN report, and you can see from the list of authors there, we had quite a good group of people contributing to that synthesis, I would call it, and what the ecological economics worldview and policies represent. Some of the key points are that this growth in material consumption is ultimately unsustainable. There are these fundamental planetary boundaries, so we can't continue to grow the physical part of the economy indefinitely. And also, beyond a certain threshold, it's really undesirable. It has a lot of negative side effects that, if we start taking into account, show that we're really not making significant and haven't been making progress for quite a while in a net sense. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, because of its negative effects on the natural and social capital parts of our assets. It doesn't really increase sustainable well-being. There are alternatives, but they're going to require a change in worldview and a change in the whole sort of regime that we're locked into, or seem to be locked into right now. Just to go back a bit, so how did we get into this? I think this is the sort of empty world vision of the economy, and that shows the sort of three primary factors of production: land, labor, and capital. But you can see that land is kind of grayed out. It's almost ignored because there's the assumption of almost perfect substitutability between these factors. And you don't really need natural resources. You always add more capital or labor. And you can use that to produce goods and services, marketed goods and services measured by GDP, which are then either consumed or reinvested to build more capital so you can produce and consume more in the next period. So there's nothing in this vision of the world that would any way limit the growth of the economy indefinitely. And that's been the sort of policy, infinite economic growth. Consumption is the main route to well-being. The more we consume, the better off we are. So what's wrong with that picture? Well, this is maybe a modification that recognizes that we live in a materially closed system, that we can't grow the material part of the economy indefinitely, that these four types of capital are all required in some more balanced way. They're not infinitely substitutable for each other, and they include our built capital assets, the conventional capital, but also human capital, individual people, their health, their education, but also social capital, all of the interactions between people, all of our formal and informal networks and institutions, and everything else, our natural capital, the environment, our natural assets. And all of those forms of assets or capital are required to produce conventional goods and services, even though that's often implicit or hidden. But they also contribute to human well-being much more directly. And as I said, there's this whole science of happiness that's evolving that shows that individual well-being is a much more complex function than the more we consume, the better off we are. In fact, on the consumption side, it's probably relative consumption that's more affects subjective well-being than absolute consumption, at least beyond a certain threshold. And there's this whole range of non-consumption related items. And in particular, what I'll focus on today is the contribution of natural capital, of ecosystem services, the benefits that people derive from functioning ecosystems. But just to be clear, there's also some significant contributions from social capital and from the other forms of capital as well. It's really the balance that we need to focus on in order to achieve sustainable well-being. So ecosystem services. Who's heard the term ecosystem services before in this room? Okay, pretty good. I was giving a talk at a convention of water engineers, and I asked the same question, and nobody had ever heard the term. So it's quite interesting how these ideas get out. This idea, I think, is gaining a lot of traction, at least in certain circles. But this is from a paper we did back in 1997, where I identified these 17 different services related to the functioning of the system. But the services are defined as the benefits that people derive from that functioning. Climate regulation, water supply, water regulation. You've probably all seen this list before. And we know that all parts of the landscape produce a range of these ecosystem services. And I think our challenge then is to better recognize what those services are, but also to better recognize how they're produced. This is a graph that just shows that they vary according to their spatial characteristics. So we know that some of them are very global and non-proximal, if you will. So, climate regulation and carbon sequestration really don't depend on where that's done on the planet, because the atmosphere is well mixed. But some are very dependent on proximity. So things like storm protection and disturbance regulation depend on the proximity of the infrastructure being protected. Some are very related to the flow, particularly of water, through the system. Some others are more in situ, the formation of soils and raw materials, and others require the movement of users to the production. So things like recreational amenities. So there's a wide variety of ways that these ecosystems influence people. It may vary in space and in time, and how they're connected to the various constituents of human well-being. This is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Who's seen that report before? Okay, we have a pretty informed audience. That was a major UN study with 1,300 scientists from around the world that tried to assess the status and trends of ecosystem services. And they categorized the services into these four basic categories: provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services, and tried to connect them with the various constituents of human well-being, which are much broader, as I said, than simply, the more we consume, the better off we are. There's a whole large list of basic human needs and constituents of well-being that need to be addressed. I think there's something that they left out of this, though, and that was, in this diagram anyway, and that was this interaction with the other forms of capital. So it's not that natural capital simply flows, or ecosystems simply flow into human well-being. It requires this interaction between all four of these basic types of assets in order to produce any sort of well-being and its sustainability. So the study of ecosystem services is inherently a transdisciplinary study. You can't just study ecology. You can't just study economics. You can't just study psychology or sociology. You really have to study how all of these things interact and what the influence is on human well-being going forward. So, is the university ready for that? Show of hands. Yes? No? Well, I think it's probably one of the more critical things that we can do going forward. If our goal is really to create, sustainable human well-being, I think we've got to get better at doing this sort of transdisciplinary research and education. I can talk more about that as we go on. First of all, there are some mistaken identities, I think, around this issue of ecosystem services. I might as well address those before we get to the questions. And one is, that economics does not equal the market, although I think that's the perception in many people's minds. Economics really should be about how do we produce well-being and sustain it. So it's much broader than the market. The market is just one institution. It's really a part of our social capital that helps us to achieve that goal, but they are not equivalent. Valuation is not the same as privatization or commodification or trading ecosystem services in markets. It's really about how do we measure or address the contribution of these services to human well-being. And privatization is a whole nother issue about how we manage those resources. And I think most ecosystem services are really best handled as public goods or common property resources and shouldn't be privatized. Expressing values in monetary units is not the same as getting those values from market or exchanges. So it's really a way of communicating the relative contribution in units that people tend to understand. But you could express those contributions in any units that could serve as a common denominator. It could be energy or time or land, etc. As I said, this whole idea of ecosystem services, I think, is really beginning to get some traction in several different circles. One recent development is this thing called IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel or Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So this is the equivalent of the IPCC, but applied to the ecosystem services side of things. There's something called the Ecosystem Services Partnership that I've been involved in helping to create, which is an effort to globally coordinate all of the various research and practice around ecosystem services. So I can direct you to this website if you want to find out more. But there's a whole range of case studies and models and networking possibilities for anyone who wants to get more involved in this. Our next annual meeting, our last annual meeting was in Bali, and our next annual meeting will be in Costa Rica. So we picked some good places to meet as well. On the academic side, there's been, exponentially growing interest in ecosystem services. There's a new journal specifically on that title by Elsevier, and this is just the number of papers published on that topic. If you search ISI, For the topic ecosystem services, you get, over 1,000 papers were published just last year, and over 8,000, almost 9,000 have been published so far. The most cited of those papers is this one that I've already mentioned. In that paper, we tried to estimate with a capital E, the total value of all of these ecosystem services across the 17 different services and 16 different biomes, and we came up with numbers in the range of $16 to $54 trillion per year, $33 trillion on average, much larger than global GDP at the time. So this was really more of a consciousness-raising, awareness-building kind of exercise, as we recognize that this is really an estimate, and probably a significant underestimate. But the only thing we didn't control in that process was what they put on the cover, and they put pricing the planet on the cover, which is not really what we were doing. What we're really doing is valuing the planet in ways that need to be appreciated in more than simply using these services for exchange values. This is a summary of the numbers that we came up with in 1997, by biome. So if you add up, over all of the studies that we synthesized, which is kind of a meta-analysis, what the value per hectare per year was, you can see that there are some systems like estuaries and coral reefs that are very, very high. Others that we really had not much data on. Certainly cropland and urban systems, there weren't many studies at the time. Even so, we came up with a fairly large number. Now, more recently, in the journal Ecosystem Services, and as part of the TEEB study, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, you may have heard of that one as well, which was funded by the Deutsche Bank and UNEP. There was an effort to build out this database and look at all of the other studies that have done. Those numbers in parentheses are the number of studies that were looked at in for each of those systems, and it just shows the mean and the average and the range of values. Again, into the tens and even hundreds of thousands of dollars per hectare per year, particularly coral reefs and coastal wetlands, but also some additional values on cropland and urban systems are beginning to be generated. This is a map of what those unit values look like when applied, just equally to the ecosystems that we're talking about. We tried to update the numbers from the 97 paper just to see how things have changed since then. Do I have a pointer somewhere? Maybe I can use this here. Okay. So we looked at first how global land use has changed from 1997 to 2001. All the numbers in red are areas that have decreased, and the ones in green are areas that have increased. So you can see that many of the very high-valued ecosystems have been decreasing in area. We also looked at how the unit values have changed based on the new studies that have come about. Again, the green numbers are increases and the red numbers are decreases. Only a few have really decreased. As we learn more, we learn that these systems are much more valuable than we had originally estimated. And then we can basically try to figure out, well, where is the change coming from? From the change in the unit values, from the change in the area, or from the change in both? And if we look at just the change in area, without using the old unit values, we get a decrease of about 4.3 trillion per year. And if we look at the change in both area and unit values, we get a change of about $20 trillion per year. So again, I think probably a significant underestimate, but a significant loss in the value of these ecosystem services based on largely on changing land use. We know that when we do change land use in these ways, if we go from, this again is from the Millennium Assessment, from intact wetlands to intensive farming, for example, there's a loss of social value. The farmers might be making more money, but the society is losing many of those valuable services. Likewise for several other land use transitions. We did a study that showed that And we tried to estimate what's the benefit cost ratio of conserving our current natural capital asset base globally. And for that, we used a scenario where we would increase the terrestrial reserve network to 15% of the terrestrial biosphere, 30% of the marine biosphere. That would cost about $45 billion a year to build and maintain. But the benefits would be the net benefits, the difference between the intact natural capital asset and what it might be converted to globally was about $4 to $5 trillion a year. So a benefit cost ratio of about 100 to 1, again, conservatively estimated. There aren't very many better investments than that you can look at these days. The only one I could find that was better was oil companies investing in political campaigns in the United States, which was about 400 to 1, unfortunately. Anyway, so this whole idea of valuing ecosystem services, I think there are a range of different uses for that exercise. One, just raising awareness and interest, which is what we were trying to do, I think, with these global studies. But they also can be used for modifying national income and well-being accounts. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But for example, the Australian Bureau of Statistics is now taking seriously this idea of how to build in ecosystem services into the national system of national accounts. And the UN system of environmental and economic accounts is, I think, finally beginning to take on board this idea of we have to build in our natural capital assets and ecosystem services into our overall national accounting framework. You can analyze specific policies and changes and land use planning scenarios. So when we're doing land use scenarios for going forward, we can use this idea to evaluate what's the change in the total value of those landscapes. This idea of payment for ecosystem services. So in some cases, we can reward private landowners for providing these services. Farmers could be paid, for example, to produce not just crops, but produce a whole range of services like nutrient retention and water supply, et cetera. Full cost accounting, I think, is an important one. How do we look at what are the external environmental costs by company and by product going forward? And I'll talk a little bit about this as well. But also, how do we build different sorts of institutional frameworks to manage these services? The idea of common asset trust, thinking of the whole ecosystem as something that we need to hold in trust for the public. We can't allow it to be an open access resource. The tragedy of the commons is really the tragedy of open access. But there are ways to manage the commons from a community point of view. And one thing you can do is assign property rights to these commons on behalf of the community as a community asset and have trustees that manage it as a trust, things like that. On the full cost accounting thing, I'm involved with a company called True Cost that has been trying to do this, is doing this for almost all the global publicly traded companies, using a fairly detailed economic input-output model that can trace the flows of impacts and inputs of ecosystem services, back through the whole supply chain for companies. So it's not so much just what the company's doing, within their own structure, but what are their suppliers doing, what are their suppliers doing, back through the whole supply chain, and get a total impact of companies on their external costs, including the health costs and the damages to ecosystem services. Puma recently has engaged True Cost to do a full-blown environmental profit and loss statement for the company, and they've encouraged several other companies to join them in that effort. And so they're able now to look at the external costs, not just by the whole company, but also down to the product level. So we can eventually say, this particular variety of shoe that they're producing has so much of the cost is what we pay in the store, but there's an additional price. And if you look at the true cost, it really consists of that total. So the market's really not telling us the truth about the cost of things we buy every day these days, because it leaves out so much of these external costs. True Cost, in collaboration with TEEB, recently produced this report, which looked at the top 100 externalities of the business community. So this kind of summarizes the results across the whole globe, and it added it all up to be about 7.3 trillion, just from the top 100 externalities. So you could take a look at this report. It's available online to get more details about that. So to achieve some of those purposes that I talked about, it's often necessary to extrapolate or aggregate these ecosystem services to different scales. And there are several ways to do that. There's the basic value transfer method, what we used in the nature study, basically assuming a constant value over different ecosystem types and just looking at the change in those ecosystems. And you can sort of modify that if you have better information about the status or health of particular parts of the forest or other systems. You can modify the values there. That's been done. If you have enough studies, you can do a more statistical approach to this value transfer. So what other variables are affecting the values, and can you sort of reduce that variance by bringing in these other variables? And finally, you can do more spatially explicit and more functional modeling of this relationship, and I'll talk a little bit about some examples there. This statistical value transfer, for example, this was done in the paper that I showed of the update of the unit values. So at least for some of those systems, there were, for inland wetlands, there were enough studies to do this statistical model, and it showed that there were several other variables that explained quite a bit of the variation in the value across those systems. Proximity to population, GDP per capita, sort of the spatial pattern of the systems, etc. So on the more functional modeling approach, I'll give one quick example of storm protection and the value of coastal wetlands for protecting against storms. And this is Hurricane Katrina approaching the coast of Louisiana. This is the storm surge from Hurricane Katrina. It was about 18 to 20 feet in height when it hit Louisiana. One of the main reasons for that was that there's been major loss of the coastal wetlands in the Mississippi Deltaic Plain. New Orleans is here, it's the Mississippi River. The Corps of Engineers has built levees all along the Mississippi River for flood control, and now all the sediments coming down the river are going off the edge of the continental shelf, causing the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and also leading to the rapid erosion and loss of these coastal wetlands. We know, for example, that over the last 6,000 years, there's been a net increase in coastal wetlands, about 3 square kilometers a year, up until the Corps started that leveeing activity and oil and gas dredging to extract oil and gas from the Deltaic Plain started. That led to a net loss of about 65 square kilometers a year. So we can go back and look at the historical tracks of hurricanes that we know about. We can look at the swath of each hurricane, and we can get data on the area of wetlands in the swath, the area and the amount of infrastructure to be damaged in the swath. And we used nighttime satellite imagery for that and converted that to GDP in the swath. We know the total damages that were done. We know the intensity of the storm. And so we can build a fairly simple statistical model that relates the relative damages to the wind speed and the wetland area. And from that, we can say, well, what's the avoided damages? If we change the wetland area by a hectare, how much do the damages go up or down? That's essentially the value of those coastal wetlands for storm protection. That explains about 60% of of course, it's a very complex interaction and phenomena, but we still get a pretty good statistical correlation between the area of wetlands and the relative damages. And we can use that then to plot the marginal value per hectare and sum up under that curve to get the total value of wetlands for storm protection. You can see there's quite a range, and the the areas that are the highest, the darker red values on this map, are where those 3 variables come together. We have a lot of infrastructure to be protected, a lot of wetlands to do the protecting, and a lot of storms to be protected from. And you could use this sort of analysis to try to understand, well, if storm intensity increases in the future, where are these places going to help out? The numbers again are fairly. There's a fairly large range, but also fairly large means, and if you add it all up, you get about $23 billion per year as the value of these coastal wetlands for storm protection. So, how does this get used in a policy sense? Well, the first reaction of the Corps of Engineers to Hurricane Katrina was, let's build a big levee, all along the coast of Louisiana. That's the ticket. Of course, if they did that, it would be very expensive. It would immediately start sinking because the whole deltaic plain is compacting still. It would only ever provide storm protection as a service, and it's really not the best way to approach this problem. And when you start thinking about these wetlands are really horizontal levees in a sense. They provide storm protection, but also that whole range of other services. Using our natural capital assets for that function is much more cost effective. So now they're taking seriously the proposals that have been around for a long time to divert the Mississippi River, to restore the coastal wetlands in Louisiana, and I think it's having that sort of impact. So, can we take this further? I think this is a very complex interaction, as I said, between all these various forms of capital and ecosystem services and human well-being. It is possible to build, in this case, a dynamic systems model that we built for trying to understand those connections between all of our natural capital assets and all of our human-made capital assets. And this model included, a conventional GDP as a production function, conventional economic production, but also a welfare function that included the inputs of ecosystem services and social capital, etc. So take a look at that if you want more detail. And this sort of thing runs, over a 200-year time span. So we can calibrate it from 1900 until 2000, approximately where we are now, and then look at various scenarios going into the future about what happens to ecosystem services in physical terms, but also in their value terms. And this leads to values that are generally larger than what we got from the simple benefit transfer approach, because you're beginning to get at the complex interactions between the ecosystem services and the other functions in the system. You can also do this in a more spatially explicit way, and this idea of modeling the landscape as an integrated system that has both the ecological, the hydrology, the vegetation, the economics, the population dynamics. I think that's sort of the direction that we're going in into the future, and our abilities to model these landscapes at that level of detail is improving quite rapidly. So we can do these kinds of simulations that tell us, and can help evaluate the different land use planning scenarios, as I mentioned, and as one of the potential uses of this evaluation exercise. We can also do things in a much longer historical time frame. This is a recent study that reconstructed the ecosystem services in the Yangtze River Basin based on pollen analysis and sediment cores, et cetera, for several different services. And the green line is this sort of an index of all of those ecosystem services, showing how they've changed, largely declined in that system from 1930 until about the present. An interesting example is a modeling study that we're doing as part of the IHOPE initiative, the Integrated History and Future of People on Earth, modeling the Maya civilization. If we really want to understand sustainability, our best examples of unsustainable systems are some historical societies that have collapsed. So can we replicate that collapse? And this is a fairly sophisticated, spatially explicit sort of combination systems and agent-based model of the Maya civilization, including population and forest condition and ecosystem services, and the sort of trade network that was developed. And this graph over here shows how, you can't read that, but this is the value from ecosystem services, the green line, the value from trade, the value from agriculture, how those all add up. And how the system sort of recovered from some major drought cycles for a while, but eventually couldn't recover because they had overextended their trade network, their population was too high, and their ecosystem services had been degraded. So what we can do with models like this is to say, well, what could the Mayas have done differently? Could they have had a sustainable system? What if they had controlled their population and moderated their forest destruction and not had such an elaborate trade network? So those sorts of things. Closer to home, we've done some work on the Great Barrier Reef and its catchment, and trying to understand what various scenarios for the future might mean in terms of ecosystem services and quality of life and human well-being. In that one, we looked at these four scenarios based on what's happening at the global scale. What's happening with, do we get CO2 emissions under control or not, and what will how will that influence ocean acidification and ocean temperature, and as opposed to what they do in the watershed. Will we get the will we focus more on environment and well-being, or will we continue to focus on economic growth? So that leads to these four different scenarios. And for each of those scenarios, then we could evaluate what happens to the various ecosystem services, what happens to the other elements of well-being in terms of human social capital, and what happens overall to our indicator of well-being, as opposed to the indicator of just economic performance. And you can see that those two are not necessarily going in the same direction. So how do we generally measure progress, though, at the global scale? We put a lot of emphasis on GDP and GDP per capita, but we know that only correlates with, in this case, life satisfaction up to a certain point, beyond which things tend to level off. So the United States has 3 times the GDP per capita as Costa Rica, but people in Costa Rica are equally happy with their lives. So there's much more to it. And when you get into it, you recognize that GDP was never designed as a measure of economic welfare or well-being. It really is only measuring economic income or activity, and only the marketed part of that activity. So it's not even measuring whether that income is sustainable, much less whether it leads to real economic welfare. And so there are some alternatives that try to get at that, including, I'll talk about this index of sustainable economic welfare and the genuine progress indicator. And we could also go beyond that, I think, and say, what are some measures of human welfare? How are human needs being met? But let me talk about this GPI or ISCW a little bit. This was designed by Herman Daly and John Cobb back in 1989. And it starts with personal consumption expenditures, but then it weights them by income distribution to recognize that a dollar's worth of income to a rich person doesn't produce as much welfare as a dollar's worth of income to a poor person. There is this decreasing marginal returns to income. So if you want to talk about welfare instead of income, you've got to adjust for the distribution. It adds a few things that are left out of GDP, like household labor and volunteer work. These are significant contributions to our well-being, but they're not marketed, so they're not picked up. And then it subtracts a whole bunch of things that are in GDP but shouldn't be, like the cost of crime and family breakdown. We don't really want more crime, but if there's more crime, there's more policemen, there's more security devices, there's more GDP, but not a good thing. Same way with water pollution, air pollution, loss of wetlands, loss of farmland, etc. Interestingly, when you do this over time, for the United States in this case, you see that GDP per capita, was doing this, GPI per capita, tracked it for a while in the post-war period till about 1980 or so, and then leveled off and really hasn't been improving at all. So we've been in a period of what Herman Daly has called uneconomic growth since about then, where the economy's growing, but it's not economic. It's not really producing more welfare. And that should be what we're really after. We're not after turning the wheels faster. We're really after producing well-being. The state of Maryland has recently adopted the GPI as their official, sort of statistic on progress. And I would encourage you to take a look at this website if you're interested in this idea. They do a very good job of explaining what all those different elements are, and also what policies the state is now implementing to improve those different elements of GPI. The state of Vermont in the U.S. has also adopted GPI, and we're working on Oregon, and so it's beginning to have some influence at the political level. We recently did a study where we looked at all of the GPI studies that have been done globally, and there were 17 countries that had enough information for us to include. Interestingly enough, Australia is doing pretty good on that measure, and New Zealand, where is it? Is this one? Not doing too badly, but kind of some real ups and downs there. United States, I think, is this one, again showing increase but then leveling off. We also compared that with a range of other indicators, including the ecological footprint, biocapacity per capita, life satisfaction, sort of surveys of people's well-being, and the Human Development Index, again for the U.S. Here you can see GDP going up, GPI, and this is based on index numbers just to show the changes. GPI tracking it for a while, but then leveling off here. What else is there? Life satisfaction also being relatively flat. And we can compare that with other countries like China, which has shown GDP just going through the roof. But when you start factoring in all those costs, GPI has leveled off since about 1995. So it was correlated again for a while, but eventually the air and water pollution and income distribution have gotten worse in China. So they're really not improving their well-being per capita. We estimated a global GPI from that and compared that with global GDP per capita, and you can see that looks somewhat like the U.S. results, where since 1978, things have really not been getting better globally. So, you get what you measure, and if we're pursuing the goal of GDP, we get increasing GDP around the world, but we don't really get what leads to a better life. And so we need to really change what it is that we're trying to measure. Certainly, this is not the perfect indicator of human well-being. But it's a better approximation than GDP because it does include at least an accounting of the negative factors and the costs, and it shows a very different result from a policy point of view. So, of course, there's always skeptics in the room, this guy in the back saying, "Yeah, what if it's all a big hoax and we create this better world for nothing?" So this gets back to my original point about the need for a different movie. We need to really emphasize that what we're talking about is creating a better world. And by the way, that involves protecting our natural capital assets and our social capital assets, and people are really going to be better off in this world. It's not a sacrifice, to make these changes. It's really a sacrifice to keep going in the direction that we are going because it's not really improving things in the world. We have to stay within our planetary boundaries, but we have to create the elements of well-being and quality of life, within those constraints. We have to stay within what Kate Raworth has called the donut. So this is going to require breaking our addiction to this growth at all costs economic paradigm, and I think it very much is an addiction. We're sort of locked in to all of the various elements of this regime, and it also explains why it's so hard to make the transition. Addictions are hard to break. One of the best ways to do it, though, is to envision a more sustainable and desirable future, to show people that there is a better way that doesn't involve continually increasing consumption, but does involve focus on quality of life, recognizing the contributions in particular of our natural and social capital assets, which have been left out of that story for so long. And we need a different media to sort of have that discussion in. The conventional academic media doesn't really focus much on solutions, but we can and are doing that. And so we've started this journal called Solutions. I would encourage you to take a look at the website, have some hard copies here. If you want to take a look at those, maybe I'll pass these around once we get them back. So take a look at what we're trying to do. One of our rules of thumb for this journal is no more than a third of the article can be about describing the problem, and 2/3 has to be about describing the solutions. So how do we have an ongoing discussion of how to solve these complex problems? You can see we have a pretty good editorial board for this. And I'll end there. Thank you very much. Even this guy's reading it.
Our future king. Can that website? Can that up on our website?
Sure. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Bob. By the way, that PowerPoint is going on our Bioprotection website, so it's very dense, wasn't it? It's the whole history of the world there. So if you want to read it again more slowly, it'll be on our Bioprotection website. Thanks to Bob's generosity. So if you weren't sure where ecosystem services were at the beginning, you probably are now. And the Bob's message seems to be we've got to sort of break the mold. We can't keep building society on the same food things that we've been building on in the past. Because ecosystem services get hit. That's rather food summary of what he's saying. There's a lot more to it than that. So my name's Steve Ratton, by the way. We haven't met. We have some time for questions, which Bob will handle, and he'll repeat the question to the audience because the acoustics only work one way in these meetings. But he has to do a Radio New Zealand interview at 6:15, just in the library here. So we've got to keep an eye on the time, if you don't mind. And there's some drinks and nibbles outside, aren't there? So when we finish talking, there's drinks and nibbles outside. And apart from the brief radio interview, Bob will be around to talk to you again individually if you wish. Okay? So any worries, concerns, disagreements, applause, audits, nibbles, you'd like to raise with Bob? If you please have a question, because we're being obvious, please tell us who you are and where you come from. Hamish Ray, I know who you are.
Lincoln University here.
Yeah, Hamish Ray, Lincoln University.
One thing that worries me is that this has been around since the 1990s, and there's still people who don't know about ecosystem services. And I'm just wondering, why is it taking so long to get through? And will we still be doing this in another 15 or 30 years' time, or still trying to get these sort of concepts out there? What has gone wrong with our education system if these concepts are out there?
Well, that's a good question. The question is, this has been around for a while, this idea. Why hasn't it, gone viral already or completely taken off? I think it is taking off. I mean, these things do take a certain amount of time, and as I showed, there's really been an exponential increase recently in the uptake of this idea. So, these kinds of changes do take a certain amount of time. I think our academic institutions, however, have not facilitated the speed of that transition, largely because they are still in academic silos. We're not really, encouraging, rewarding transdisciplinary research, which just basically requires and involves enough. So that's sort of slowed down the process. So I think if we can really maybe ramp it up to the next stage by modifying or our educational institutions and the rewards for doing this kind of work. So one of the ideas there is to do more what you might call solutions-focused courses to get students and faculty to focus, not just on going to lectures, but to focus on trying to solve a real problem on the ground. So this course that was mentioned about, what's the optimal agriculture for Earth, we're going to do that as a solutions-focused course and get faculty from several different relevant disciplines and students from different departments and try to solve that problem. I think that's one of the few ways I've seen that really successful at getting this transdisciplinary cooperation to actually work. And you solve problems at the same time, and you can publish the results. So it's a win-win situation, but it's certainly not the way we do most of our education these days.
So that just to recap, that's going to happen next, probably first and second semester next year. And what's the title we came up with? Ecologically optimal.
What was the title again?
Ecologically optimal agriculture on planet Earth.
Yeah,
that's right. Ecologically optimal agriculture for planet Earth, which is a very big statement. And Lincoln postgraduate students and those of ANU will get the data welcome to join us next year. They've already into a publication as good as the 1997 one.
Or even better.
Yeah, I'm Stuart Kennedy with OCAD University in Toronto and the Long Out Foundation in San Francisco. I was very taken with your cartoon of an inconvenient truth and a reassuring lie and the call for the third movie, perhaps a compelling vision. And I wondered what, aside from the solutions journal that you ended on, what are the closest approximations to that third movie that you've come across? It sort of goes to the question that this gentleman just asked about.
Why haven't we?
The vision catching on.
Yeah.
Not why hasn't it happened, but what's the closest thing to it having happened?
Yeah. That's a good question, too. What's the closest thing to having this vision sort of actually occur? Well, I think there are several models out there that are headed in the right direction, if not getting there. I mean, there are certainly cities like Portland, Oregon, that are trying to do much of this kind of thing. There's the whole transition town movement. I think certainly some countries are doing this better than others. Scandinavia, sort of comes up a lot as a place that's really gotten the balance a bit better than most other places. So I think we have models at several scales to look at. One of the regular sections in solutions is called on the ground, and like where are the places that are doing that. So you could take a search through the website, and I think you get some at least a whole a collection of examples. But I think the challenge is still to get it out to the general public, and I don't think certainly haven't achieved that. I think we've gotten it out to the academic community, we've gotten it out to the policy community, but the general public still doesn't get this message. And I think that may take a movie, literally. David Cameron, instead of doing Avatar, if he did something set in I haven't really seen any Hollywood blockbuster type movies that are set in a near term but positive future. So any script writers or TV or movie producers out there, or if you know anybody, I think that's what I would encourage, because something like that could really tip the process and get people really excited about a better future that's very different from where we seem to be headed. We know from some limited surveys that we've done that people are getting they're not really happy about the direction that we're going in. People see that this is not a good direction. Even if they say they're relatively happy on their personal life, you say, is the country headed in the right way? They're very pessimistic and skeptical, and looking for an alternative that's a better path. So I think that's one of our biggest challenges, is to get that vision shared. And I think that's how do we do that, and also to get it out to the general public.
I do recommend that Solutions magazine. 400,000 hits a month, you say?
An issue. So about
400,000 hits an issue. Somebody's reading it. But we hope it'll make a difference when we read it. But I do like that magazine.
We need more of those.
It talks about the future, what we do about it. It's in a version all the time. Any other questions, Mr. Bolton? Can you tell us who you are and where you come from, please?
So I'm David White from Land Research. We've touched on a lot of the climate issues, the big storms that you spoke about, and how ecosystems are protected against them. But clearly, when there are those big events such as fire or storms, then ecosystem services could be wiped out in just a matter of a few hours. So I'm wondering, do you build any element of risk of loss of ecosystem services in the evaluations that you do?
Yes. I think in the studies that I showed, no, but I think in principle one could, and I think that's where the sort of integrated dynamic modeling kind of approach can really help to answer those kinds of questions, where you can play with the uncertainties and show the range of possible scenarios that could occur. So there's still a lot of work to be done. I think we're still sort of at the front edge of a lot of this research. And but like I said, it's going to take a collaborative effort across a whole range of disciplines in order to actually address these problems. We can't stay in the silos that we've been in for centuries now.
think that silos message has come out of Bob's talk many times, and we should think about that in our daily lives at Lincoln or Lancaster or Dock where we work. You know, we're all in little boxes, so aren't we, to some extent. So a message like Lincoln could be very agile in that respect, I'd say, more perhaps than we are now. So that's what we're talking about at the moment. Any other questions, Bob?
I'm done with that. Conventional cosmetic analysis uses discounting rate, which is not very useful for showing future value of among the values.
Sorry.
Conventional cosmetic analysis uses discounting rate.
Discount rate.
Yeah. So it is not very useful to show the future value of environmental goods and services. So do you have any alternative method, and have any country use that sort of method?
You're asking about the discount rate. If you use the conventional discount rate, I think here in New Zealand, the official rate is like 6%, down from 8% inside of the future. The higher the discount rate, the more you discount the future. So with a discount rate of 6 or 8%, anything that happens more than 50 years in the future basically counts for nothing. And that's how a lot of economic analysis is done. But that doesn't really favor natural capital and things that last a long time. It doesn't favor taking a longer-term view. There's been a lot of discussion and research about that, and I think the consensus, at least in the ecological economics community, is that we should be using a much lower discount rate, maybe even a zero discount rate, especially for our natural capital assets. And we shouldn't necessarily use the same discount rate for built capital as for natural capital, because discount rates are really intended to help us compare investments. Is it better to invest in something that returns 8%, or to put your money in the bank that returns, an equivalent amount? Though no banks are doing 8% these days. And so it's not the same with natural capital. And also, we should incorporate the uncertainty about the future into this analysis. And so some have proposed, you might use a discount rate, but not one that's continuing at the same rate into the future. Which the discount rate should change as you go forward. Anyway, I think humans as individuals are prone to over-discounting the future, but as a society, we should use a much lower discount rate. I think there's lots of support, at least in the academic community, for doing that.
Any more questions? You want to do all this?
Roger Peck from Landcare Research. You showed a couple of industries that are alternatives to GDP. And one of them, Australia, was tracking particularly well.
Yeah.
Good luck with good management.
Probably a bit of both. Yeah, and it may largely be good luck, but there was a significant decrease here from quite a good point in the 70s. I didn't show the income distribution rates. I think Australia has been doing not as badly as some other countries, like the United States, where the income distribution has been getting a lot worse. And also in China, it's been getting a lot worse. And so that may have something to do with it. I haven't really decomposed why that is. Philip Lawn from Flinders University did this study of Australia. So if you like, I could send you the more detailed analysis. You can look at the factors that encourage it. And there's some people from Massey University, I think, that did the New Zealand one. Part of the issue is that all of these studies were done largely by academics or NGOs, and not totally consistent in their methods. And so, there's some error bars that we should put around this. But I think the fact that this is quite a compelling difference in the two curves, and I think there's definitely something there, even if it's not exactly where we show it. And I think it's pretty obvious to people too that when you think about some of the air and water pollution and income distribution problems, that a lot of what we call growth is really illusory, or progress, I should say. You need to keep an eye on the time because of this radio. You've got another 4 minutes or 5 minutes.
No.
This one. Do this one.
He has a question. Go. Oh, go ahead.
Rod Haig from the Department of Conservation. How confident are you that the political and social enlightenment that's required to make the changes will act before some catastrophe drives that change?
I'm hopeful, but I'm not sure I could put any kind of probabilities around it. But I think we have to be hopeful and to sort of pursue that agenda. And there are a few interesting hopeful statistics. There's a book out recently called The Cultural Creatives. I'm not sure if you ever ran across that, by Paul Ray and Sherry Anderson. They asked a series of sort of worldview questions to people in the U.S. and then categorized those worldviews into three categories. So there were the modernists, the traditionalists, and the cultural creatives, or the kind of, sustainability, the people that would go along with what I've been saying. So, and the modernists are kind of the conventional view, and traditionalists, you can imagine what their worldview is. So, what fraction of the U.S. population do you think is currently in the cultural creatives category?
37.
How many?
37.
37? Okay. You read the book? Most people would say some very low fraction, but it actually is becoming a significant portion of the population, and it's growing quite rapidly. So all of this education stuff and that we're doing is having an impact. It's just not showing up in the media. There's no media mirror, as Paul Ray says, for that worldview. But eventually, we'll reach if the trend continues, we'll reach a tipping point where things will seem to change overnight, even though they've been building up for a long time. And that's why it takes time for that cultural shift to happen. Is there a question?
Yeah, I mean, most of human history has been defined by warfare. And if you've got a large GDP, you can afford a large military machine to attack your neighbours and take their resources, or defend yourself against attack. So does your model either assume that humans are going to renounce warfare, or does it build is peace of mind by maintaining a large military machine to defend yourselves? Is peace of mind built into your GPI?
That's a good question, but maybe I'll answer a different question.
70 years ago, Australia, the humans currently running Australia were almost supplanted by another set of humans that wanted to run Australia. So only 70 years ago.
Yeah. Well, here's an observation, though. And I think a lot of the warfare that has occurred, and this occurs, I think, in ecological systems as well as in human systems. It's when you have resources to capture, in the sort of early successional stages. That's when it pays to be competitive and to go out and try to capture those other resources before the other guys do, whether they're other plants or other people. But once you've filled up the system, and we're now in this full world context, then that sort of competition doesn't pay off as much, because you can't really gain much from that, from that sort of expansionism. So then I think it starts paying more to be cooperative, to set up global trade networks, to not try to achieve improvements by warfare, but try and achieve improvements by cooperative, trading and other kinds of relationships. And I think that's sort of where we're getting to, although, the wars are smaller now. The counter argument is, okay, when resources really become scarce, then we're going to have to start fighting over what's left. But I think, in fact, we would certainly be better off if we didn't fight over those last resources, if we tended to share them. And often when things are scarce and when things are getting bad, that's when the cooperative nature of people really comes out the most. So you can create a very hopeful scenario too, that are running into resource limits and planetary constraints will actually require us to be more cooperative, to get past the whole sort of war and growth are the answer. More towards cooperation is the answer. We better do one more quick one. Yeah.
Just one more. Then Robert's question. Maybe very quickly, but let's put it in the plan.
just looking at the current politics of the Tea Party, the Taliban, etc., are the traditionalists actually starting to grow?
Yeah. So are the traditionalists and the modernists, I guess, starting to grow again at the expense of the cultural creatives? I don't know. I haven't seen any latest statistics, but I think the Tea Party is really, a very small segment of the population. It's been getting funding from another very small, very rich segment of the population. It doesn't really represent the 99% that are out there and really want something to change. Okay, I think I'm going to go.
Before he goes, what makes... Well, he's got to do the video there, that's fine. Ignore stupidity. Anyway, what makes it good talk? It makes you think, and it makes you want to do something different. So that talk for me makes me think and makes me want to do something different. So we'll continue on this. Thanks very much.